Hi guys, this is Andrew with Headphones.com. Welcome to the Headphone Show, and today we're going to do a quick comparison for the Dekoni pads on the Focal Clear, which is right here. And this is one of my absolute favorite headphones, even just with its stock pads. And so you may be wondering, well, why do you need to pad swap? And the answer is you don't. The stock tuning here with default pads right here is actually excellent. So let's begin by answering the question, why would you want to pad swap this in the first place when it already sounds great with the default pads? There are a number of answers to this. The first is, of course, that if your pads are worn out or damaged, you would need to replace them. The replacement ones from Dekoni range in price, but they're all generally quite a bit less expensive than the default ones from Focal here. The second reason you might want to pad swap is that the default ones from Focal are white, and then if you get the Pro version, I believe they're red. The Pro version is the same. It's the same headphone. It's just a different SKU where you get different colors, and then you also get an additional set of pads. So you might not need to pad swap for that one. But for the default one, it's white here, and this means that over time it can get a little bit discolored and not look as nice. A little bit faded. And so that might be something to consider if you want to make sure that your headphones stay looking awesome like this. Now, the third reason you might want to switch pads is to change the flavor of the sound a little bit, which again, the Focal Clear is awesome to begin with, but this is sort of, for the people who don't like getting into EQ, this is a way that you can change the sound without having to dig into that. And it's nice because you can run it off of a wide range of sources if you don't have EQ at the ready. So this is something that I think a lot of people will gravitate towards if they're not happy with the default sound, which once again, is awesome on the Focal Clear. But maybe you want something a little bit warmer, maybe you want something with a bit more bass, or you want something with a little bit more relaxed tuning there in the upper mids and treble or something like that, and then you can look into these pad swaps. And lastly, for those of us who really like to get into the nitty-gritty with this kind of stuff, and we do like to EQ, and I personally fall into this last category, I like to pad swap because I like to find the pads that make it the easiest to EQ, meaning that if there's a specific pad that makes it so that I only EQ one range rather than having to add, really narrow peak filters or anything like that, I'll tend to prefer the pads that allow for a more conservative EQ. And that's me, and that's really what I'm looking for when I'm doing these pad swaps on here, because I do find that with the default pads here, while it is not too difficult to EQ, you do have to add in some fairly narrow Q values there, some narrow peak filters to be able to, improve some of the treble response there to make it a little bit less gritty, which once again, it's not that bad. It's really just occasionally on some tracks, but if you want to smooth that out a little bit, you got to reduce some of those peaks. There's one at around 6K hertz and one at around 8K hertz. So let me just go over the different pad options that we have here from Dekoni. And of course, Dekoni is a well-known company that does a lot of pads for different headphones. So it's not just for Focal; they make pads for all kinds of different brands. But these are the ones that happen to work with the open back Focal headphones. So that's the Clear, the Allure, and the Utopia. And I think you could do it with the LX as well. So in the future, I may do another video with the Utopia. But this one is just going to be the Clear because that's the one I happen to have here available right now. But I have also tried these with the Allegia, and I'll let you guys know how that sounds later on. But just so you guys know, these are meant for the open back ones primarily and not necessarily the closed back ones. So this one is the Elite Velour Solids, which are on the headphone right now, which you can see here. This box contains the perforated sheepskin one, and actually you can see that they've matched the box to the type of pad that it is. So if it's perforated, it's got the dots, whereas if it's not perforated, it's just solid. So that's this one here. So you can see it's the perforated leather sheepskin one. And this resembles the Focal Utopia pad, the original one actually. This one is the hybrid one, which is right here. So you can see it's leather on the outside, but then it's this more velour material for where it connects to your head. And then this last one here is the sheepskin solid pad, which is right here. So it's all leather all the way around. Now, what do these do for the sound? Well, in general, they're not that different from the default Focal pads for the, for the overall tonality. Like if you zoom out and you look at the general curve for this, you'll see that it's not that different. And if anybody wants to see some of the measurements that I've done of these, that will be published on headphones.com as well. So you guys can check that out. I'll leave a link in the description for that if you want to take a closer look at it. But I'll give a general description of how these each sound, and I do have a preference for one, and it's not the default one actually. So let me just get into that. So beginning with the hybrid pads here, so that's with the leather material on the outside and then the velour material on top. This does also have some perforations on the inside. you get a little bit more bass emphasis when compared to the default pads. The lower mids are fairly similar, but then you do get a little bit less energy around 1 to 2k hertz, which is fine actually. And there's actually a little bit more energy there around 3 to 4k hertz. Which is, again, totally fine. Unfortunately, this doesn't fix the 6k hertz peak issues that sometimes are there on the Focal Clear. So it doesn't completely get rid of the grittiness there for the consonant tones, but it does help with the 8k hertz region, where normally there's a bit of a peak there, and with these hybrid pads there isn't. So really it just sort of shifts where that grittiness is a little bit. I think normally you hear this with the S sounds, and then with the hybrid pad you still hear it, but it's sort of like on the lower end of the S sounds that's a little bit sharp there. And so this fixes one of the issues, but not all of them. And then there is a little bit of shimmer there around 10k hertz. You want there to be a dip around 10k hertz because that's where you have some interaction with one of the pieces of your ear. But on both the default pads and the hybrid pads, there isn't a dip around 10k hertz. It's a little earlier than that. So if you want to get rid of some of that shimmer quality, you would adjust 10k hertz, just like I recommend with the default pads. And then, yeah, you would drop the 6k hertz peak as well. So while the hybrid pads don't perfectly fix some of the grittiness that you sometimes get in the treble with the default pads, they do improve some aspects, and this is a fine pad to use, but it's not my favorite. Now let's talk about the perforated sheepskin pads here. This one is fairly similar for the bass and lower mid-range. There's a little bit less upper mid-range energy around 3 to 4k hertz with this one. Interestingly, this is a little bit more filled in there in the lower treble moving up to around 6k hertz. And this actually makes it so that the elevation around 6k hertz is quite a bit more gradual. And that's a good thing. It means that, what's normally a bit of a peak there, it's not as noticeable. And it does also remove the 8k hertz peak as well. So that was interesting with this one. It's still a little bit on the aggressive side occasionally because of the 6k forwardness, but this is, in my opinion, a little bit better there than some of the peaks you get from the default pads, even though it's also a little bit more relaxed there in the upper mids. Unfortunately, you do still get a little bit of that 10k hertz shimmer with this, so that's one of the areas where I would also still EQ it. Again, this is just optional, like you don't have to EQ that if it sounds great to you already, but for me, I prefer to reduce 10k hertz by a little bit. And then also I do boost 2k hertz a little bit as well, just to get a little bit more of that sort of mid-range proper presence to come through and make sure it's a little bit more balanced. While I do like this pad, I think for some of the treble issues that may come across occasionally with the Focal Clear, it's not necessarily easier to EQ for me because I would still need to add a few adjustments there rather than a just general more conservative adjustment. So once again, I think this is a totally fine pad to use, specifically if you want a little bit more of a relaxed upper mid-range presence there, and then I do recommend it, but it's also not my favorite. Now moving on to the solid sheepskin pads. The solid sheepskin pad is very similar to the default pad. For the most part, there's a little bit more emphasis around 1k hertz with this one, which again, I don't know if that's actually a good thing on this. And then also there's quite a strong resonance there around 6k hertz. That's a very narrow peak. So the sibilance peak around 8k hertz is completely gone, but it's sort of been shifted downwards a little bit with this one. Once again, this is also a little bit more relaxed in the upper mids as well, like around 3k hertz, which is, again, totally fine in my opinion where this is at. The rest of the treble is actually fairly even with this one. I don't know if I would recommend this without EQ though, because it does make that 6k hertz peak a little bit stronger, a little bit more noticeable. But it does also make it easier to EQ because that's also just one spot that you need to EQ. So once again, this one is probably the most similar to the default ones, just with a shifted treble resonance there down to 6k hertz instead of 8k hertz, even though the default one also has a little bit of 6k hertz emphasis there as well. Now moving on to the last pad I have here, which is the one that's actually on this headphone. This is the velour pads. First of all, I gotta say the velour pads are unbelievably comfortable. These are far and away the most comfortable pads that I've tried for this headphone, and they're more comfortable even than the default ones, which is saying something because those are already pretty comfortable. And in particular, it's not just that the material here is really nice and soft, but like the cushiony aspect of it almost feels kind of like memory foam. Like it's almost easier to press down with this one, and it doesn't feel as springy as some of the other ones. So I really like this material that they're using for the actual pad part. But also, this is my favorite pad to use. Overall, the sound for this one is a little bit more balanced overall, I find, for the upper mids and lower treble. So in my mind, this actually fixes that slight grittiness there that you sometimes get. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't EQ this. This does also benefit a little bit from EQ. There's a bit of an elevation there around 11k hertz, like 10 to 11k hertz. So I do drop that once again on this, and I think that does help. I'll leave my EQ preset with this as well there. And then also I find that this did boost the bass a little bit as well. Now, that doesn't mean that you won't necessarily enjoy these other ones. I think there are good reasons to prefer the other ones here, you know, depending on the flavor that you would like. I think the most important thing to consider is where you want your upper mid-range to be. And in most cases, they do help with some of that grittiness that occasionally is there with the default pads. So I think, you know, overall they're fine, you know, regardless. It's just that for what I like and for what my preference is, these velour ones were the best. And for those of you guys who want to see how this looks when I'm wearing it, I know you guys are out there, right? This is how it looks. I think it looks fine. I actually prefer the sort of white and black aesthetic rather than the sort of all white aesthetic. But, you know, that's just, you know, personal preference, of course. Nonetheless, I mean, I think this is a great alternative. I think all these pads are awesome alternatives if you don't want to shell out, you know, all the money that you would need to buy, you know, replacement pads, you know, from the official ones here. You know, these are third-party pads, and usually what happens with third-party pads is that the tuning isn't as good as what it was with the default pads because, you know, they were designed specifically for that one headphone. And, you know, usually if you buy third-party pads and throw it on, you're going to totally screw up the frequency response because, you know, the engineer didn't have those third-party pads in mind. And so because of that, it's cool to see that, you know, Dekoni has really taken the frequency response into consideration, at least it looks like, with a lot of these. Anyways, I did also mention that, you know, these are for the open back headphones and not the closed back ones. And I did try to measure these on the Focal Elegia, which is the closed back one. And for most of them, it just completely killed the bass, but not on these ones here. The solid sheepskin pads for the Focal Elegia actually worked reasonably well. They boosted the bass. And then they did subdue, you know, the upper mids and treble a little bit there as well. So it's a little bit relaxed still in the upper mids and treble. So it's not quite as energetic there, you know, to my taste. So I did EQ that as well. But I was really impressed at, you know, what this was able to do for the bass and then the mids, because on the Elegia, the mids are a little bit forward there. For anywhere from like 400 to like 2K hertz, the mids are quite forward. And with this pad here, it's not. It's quite a bit more balanced there from the bass and the mids. So again, if you're like me, this is something that may help with making it easier to EQ. But if you're not into EQ, this is just a different flavor for the Focal Elegia as well that you could in theory do. I wouldn't get any of these other ones for the Elegia. Just this solid one here is, you know, if you want more bass, this will do it for you. But in any case, that does it for this video. Thanks for taking the time to watch it, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.